In just 6 weeks, nearly 300,000 people were murdered in a single city. This didn't happen because there weren't enough military troops near that city. Actually, from both sides, there were almost the same number of soldiers. But when the government itself ran away, leaving its own capital, everything started to fall apart, and orders became unclear. Soldiers didn't know what to do. Some fled out of fear, and the remaining were killed one by one. Some groups of soldiers had their hands and feet bound, and they were buried in the ground while still alive. Some soldiers were locked inside houses from the outside, and the whole house was set on fire. Some were taken to the beach, and after that they were shot, and their bodies were thrown into the sea. And many others were lined up in an open area, then shot with machine guns into a pit until most of them were killed, and when the city finally fell, control disappeared completely. What followed was weeks of violence across the city, but this wasn't limited to soldiers alone. Civilians, men, the elderly, children, and especially women were all affected. And what happened to many of them would leave one of the darkest marks in modern history. This is what history remembers as the Nanjing Massacre. As the days passed, the violence inside the city didn't just continue, it changed. It was no longer only about soldiers or control or territory. It began to affect those who had nothing to do with the war. Women across the city were among the most vulnerable. Many were taken from their homes, separated from their families, with no way to resist what was happening around them. For them, survival was no longer about escaping the war, but about enduring it. And this is the part of history that is often the hardest to talk about because it goes beyond battle and into something much more personal. What happened to many of these women was not just a consequence of war, it was a complete breakdown of humanity. In a city that had already lost its leadership and its protection, there was no one left to stop it. This is why the events in Nanjing are remembered not just as a battle, but as one of the darkest moments in modern history. By the time these weeks had passed, the city was no longer the same. Homes were empty. Streets that once had life now carried only the aftermath of what had happened. And for those who survived, the war didn't end when the violence stopped. They had to live with the memory of it. History often talks about wars as battles between nations. Maps change, borders move, and victories are recorded. But events like this remind us that the real cost of war is not measured on a map. It's measured in the lives of ordinary people who had no control over what was happening around them. Even today, what happened in Nanjing is remembered, not just as a historical event, because history is not just about what happened in the past, it's about what we choose to learn from it. But what happened in Nanjing wasn't sudden. It was the result of years of buildup. To understand how a city reached this point, we need to go back decades earlier. Back to a time when Japan was just beginning to rise, and China was somehow struggling internally, starting to. In 1894, the First Sino-Japanese War changed the balance of power in Asia. At the time, Japan was rapidly modernizing, building a strong military and adopting new technology. China, under the Qing dynasty, was slow to modernize, facing instability and gradually losing control. The conflict began over control of Korea. Both sides, China and Japan, wanted influence over the region, but when tensions rose, neither side backed down. On one side was Japan's modern, well-trained army. On the other, the forces of Qing China, still relying on older systems and weaker coordination. As the war began, Japan moved quickly. It defeated Chinese forces in a series of battles, both on land and at sea. City after city fell, and China struggled to respond effectively. Within a year, the outcome was clear. Japan had won. And this victory didn't just end a war, it marked the beginning of something bigger. With the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895, after its defeat, China was forced to accept the terms set by Japan. It recognized Korea as independent, effectively removing Chinese influence from the region. It handed over territories, including Taiwan, and it agreed to pay a large financial indemnity to Japan. This wasn't just a peace agreement, it was a shift in power. For the first time, Japan had defeated a major regional power and gained both territory and confidence from it. And from this point on, Japan was no longer just rising, it was expanding. The balance in Asia had clearly shifted. Japan had gained territory, money, and confidence. It began strengthening its military even further and started looking outward for more resources and influence. China, on the other hand, was still dealing with internal struggles, trying to recover from defeat but failing to keep pace. Over the next few decades, this gap only grew wider. Japan became more and more organized and ambitious, and China remained unstable, susceptible to pressure from outside powers. One region in particular became extremely important: Manchuria. It was rich in resources, strategically valuable, and close to Japanese-controlled areas. Then, in 1931, something happened that would change everything. A small explosion occurred on a railway line near Mukden. Japan blamed Chinese forces for the attack and used it as a reason to take action. Within a very short time, Japanese troops moved in. They quickly took control of Manchuria, facing little organized resistance, and soon after, a new state was established under Japanese control. Japan had now moved deep into Chinese territory, and the situation was no longer stable. From this point on, tensions didn't decrease, they only continued to rise. Japan now had a strong military presence inside Chinese territory, and over the next few years, that presence only grew. At the same time, small clashes between Chinese and Japanese forces became more frequent, not full-scale war, but enough to keep both sides on edge. By 1937, the situation had become extremely tense. Both sides were prepared, and it felt like something bigger was about to happen. On July 7, 1937, near Beijing, Japanese troops were conducting night drills close to a strategic bridge. When one of their soldiers was reported missing, they demanded access to a nearby Chinese-controlled area. The request was refused. Shots were fired. This moment is known as the Marco Polo Bridge incident. What started as a small confrontation quickly turned into full-scale war. And this time, it wouldn't be limited to one region. Japanese forces began advancing deeper into China, and one of their main targets soon became the capital itself, Nanjing. By late 1937, Japanese forces were advancing rapidly, and Nanjing, the capital of China at the time, was directly in their path. As the army approached, the government began to leave the city. Leadership moved away, and control inside Nanjing started to weaken. Soldiers were left with unclear orders. Civilians didn't know whether to stay or escape. Large groups of people began searching for safety. Many gathered in designated safe zones, areas that were meant to protect civilians from the violence outside. And one of the most important figures behind these zones was a man named John Rabe. John was a German businessman living in Nanjing at the time. He was not a soldier, not a politician, but someone who chose to stay when many others left. Along with a small group of foreigners, he helped establish what became known as the Nanjing Safety Zone, an area where civilians could gather, hoping to find protection. At that time, this small zone became one of the only places where some form of order still existed. Thousands of people took shelter there, and for many, it was the only reason they survived. But even this was not enough to stop everything that was happening outside. Outside those zones, discipline began to disappear. What started as a military occupation slowly turned into something far more uncontrolled. Soldiers were no longer just fighting an enemy, they were acting without restraint. Groups of women were taken with no explanation. It became clear that this was no longer just about war. It had gone far beyond the battlefield. Fear spread across the city because no one knew what would happen next. Fathers cut their daughters' hair, husbands cut their wives' hair, forcing them to look like boys, hoping it might protect them from what was happening in the city. By this point, people had already started to understand who was most at risk. There were times soldiers would enter the edges of these zones and tear down Chinese flags in front of the people inside. It wasn't random, it was meant to provoke a reaction. In the confusion and anger, some stepped outside the boundary, believing they could respond or that it was still safe to do so. But outside, the situation was very different. Those who crossed that line were no longer under any protection, and slowly, even the idea of a safe zone began to feel uncertain. Inside the camps, things were getting worse. Food was running out, people were getting sick, and there was very little medicine. So at this point, Japanese soldiers started putting pressure on the camps. They said they could provide food and medicine, but in return, they wanted women. This message, when it reached camp, for the people inside, this was not a real choice. It was survival against something they could not control. And in that moment, some women stepped forward because someone had to. For their families, for the people around them, they made that choice. Because sometimes, survival demands a price. And in Nanjing, that price was paid by those who had the least choice.